Okay, Luigi Pistaferri is a professor of economics at Standford University, research fellow MBER, CEPR, IJA, the Prof. Randall Senior Fellow at CEPA, and one of the co-editors of the American Economic Reviews. His work on the intersection between labor economics and macroeconomics, and he's going to share his research on consumption inequalities today. Luigi, over to you.
Thank you, Susan, for the invitation to this conference. It was my first time in Australia, also in this beautiful place. So I'm not going to perform any traditional Italian dance. So my wife can attest, I'm not very good at it. So I'm going to be talking about consumption inequality, summarizing a little bit of the research, not just my own. So there is a big issue. So as you know, there is a big debate in the US and other societies about the rising levels of inequality. Now, most of the discussion on inequality is being phrased typically, at least the way you see it in newspapers, or in the popular media in terms of income, or components of income or wealth, if you are a reader of Piketty's work. Now, ideally, what we would like to be measuring is whether there has been a concurrent increase in welfare or well-being or living standards or whatever you want to call the idea of welfare. Now, for economists, as we all know, individual well-being is typically measured in terms of utility. And this is the thing that people maximize in our elaborate problems. And utility is typically a function of things like consumption or leisure. So today I'm going to discuss an alternative view, what we know about this alternative view of measuring well-being or welfare or living standards, which is consumption. And the discussion is going to be in terms of what we know about the United States, but because this is the country that I know a little bit better. But the issues or the things that are important for measuring and thinking about consumption inequality are a little bit more general than just thinking about a particular country like the US. And because this is a conference where the China element is very important, I'm going to try to spend some time describing the role that China's imports or the increasing openness to international trade towards China has had for the measurement and the way we think about consumption inequality in the US. And as I'll try to argue, the role is a little bit ambiguous because things go in opposite direction, and so we don't have a real clear answer about the impact of this particular important phenomenon on the way we measure welfare, at least for the United States. Now, there are some, the idea that sometimes consumption can be a better measure of welfare, well-being, or living standards than income is not new. There are actually some authoritative views, besides mine, that have made this comment. So this is Chairman Greenspan, or former chairman of the Fed, the Federal Reserve. Greenspan, who says exactly what I would like him to say. That is, first he comments on the fact that there are surprising differences between trends in income inequality and consumption inequality. I'm going to discuss the fact that he was based this comment on kind of data that were a little bit problematic. But then the main point is that he says, I don't wish to disparage income as a partial antidote to insecurity. Nevertheless, some aspects of economic well-being seem or maybe more accurately discerned by examining consumption. And he's not the only one. This is a similar quote that actually comes from Bill Gates, of all people. So he has a blog where he discusses economic phenomena, and he basically makes the same point that Greenspan was making. So he says that he's disappointed that Piketty focused all his book on wealth or income, while in fact he's neglecting consumption altogether. Consumption data represents the goods and services that people buy and can add a lot of depth to our understanding of how people actually live. And particularly rich societies, like of course the US case, the income lens really doesn't give you a sense of what needs to be fixed. And I'm going to be spending some time on this. So what are the, theoretically, and I'm just going to touch just on a few of these, of the items on this list. What are the advantages and disadvantages of basing a measurement of inequality of consumption rather than income? So the main advantage is the theoretical appeal. So as I said in the introduction, we economists think that people don't care about income per se, but about the goods, so the things that we can afford to buy with income, that is consumption, leisure, and so forth. And if you have ever taken any economics class in macro, you know that the kind of basic framework for thinking about consumption decisions is the permanent income hypothesis, or the life cycle hypothesis. In this theory, consumption is a better measure of the kind of lifetime or permanent resources of the household, because income can fluctuate a lot. But if we have the ability to save or borrow, then we like or prefer a smooth consumption profile. We don't like to live in, spend a lot in one period and spend very little in another period. We try to borrow or save to smooth the income fluctuations. So income can be temporarily high, temporarily low, but if we can borrow and save, consumption represents a better measure of the kind of permanent or lifelong well-being of a household. And the wealth effect is kind of being now, people point out that the wealth effect is an important element of consumption decision, especially after the financial crisis. So we can observe income being fairly flat, but consumption decision being incredibly changing because of the fortunes of our assets. So if we becoming more rich because our house is valued at a higher price, then we can, this enrichment effect, this wealth effect may push us to consume more, but just looking at income will miss that particular aspect. And the same is true in reverse. The slowness of the recovery in consumption is partly due to the fact that even if income is not changing, people have had a lot of their wealth destroyed in the stock market or the housing market, and so their consumption is being dragged down by what is called a balance sheet effect. Now the other two I will jump, and of course the other side of the coin is that if credit markets are not perfect, so there's a lot of friction in credit markets, then income and consumption are somehow measuring the same thing, the ability to buy things with current resources instead of being able to borrow and save. And similarly, if people are myopic, if they don't follow our very elaborate theories, if they just choose some rule of thumb of spending a certain fraction of their income no matter what, then the consumption is not a necessarily better measure of wealth or well-being than income. Now, the debate on, as we will see, I will spend some time on this, which I think is conceptually the more important element for doubting about using consumption as measure of well-being. That is the fact that we ideally would like to measure consumption, but in data sets or in data what we observe, we'll start with spending. And there might be a dramatic difference between consumption and spending, and I'm going to detail what is involved in this difference. The questions of interest that have been hanging around in the literature are, first, do measure of consumption paint a different picture about the evolution of inequality than what can be painted by income? Do the trends differ? And are these differences reliable in the sense of the measurement? And indeed, the debate on the measurement of consumption inequality has taken like two views. The first is there are important measurement problems, and the second is more conceptual. So the measurement problems are, we need to have micro data, we need to have individual household data to measure consumption inequality. And in many countries, including the US, the UK, and pretty much all the countries I know, data sets that collect information, detailed information on consumption are much smaller in size and coverage, and less frequent than those collecting income data. So if you want to measure income inequality in the US, you have access to at least 4 or 5 data sets with large sample sizes and high quality. If you want to measure consumption inequality, you have effectively access to only 2 data sets, and only one is designed to collect information on consumption, which is the Consumer Expenditure Survey. Moreover, what kind of add to the problems, there seems to be substantial complication associated with non-random participation and item non-response. In particular, the evidence points to the fact that rich households are much harder to interview. They have a higher non-response rate. So naturally, you may seem to measure less consumption inequality simply because you're missing the top tail of the distribution because people don't participate in service. And this is definitely the case in the US. So this measurement problem has changed quite dramatically the view of consumption, the evolution of consumption inequality in the US. In the first half of the 80s and the 90s, where income inequality was trending up quite dramatically, some people presented research showing that consumption inequality actually remained flat. And this was great news for the right wing, because you could claim, we don't care about income inequality going up. If we use consumption inequality as a measure of living standards or welfare, the fact that it's flat suggests that things are not as bad as people want to depict it. And so this was the typical picture you would see, and the typical picture someone like Greenspan was referring to in the quote that I showed you before. Income inequality was going up, consumption inequality from the data was pretty flat. This growing gap induced people like Kruger and Perry to say most of the increase in inequality in income is transitory, and this has generated demand for more efficient credit markets. And this was kind of a paper written in 2004, before the financial crisis. So the big run-up in debt is partly coming from a response to this, endogenous response to the fact that there is a lot of transitory uncertainty, so we want to borrow and save more frequently, so we want markets that actually allow us to do so. Explosion in credit markets, in credit card debt, explosion in housing debt, and so forth. Now, this was research done before actually realizing that the data sets that we use to measure consumption inequality are not as good as we would like to think they are. So there are now a series of papers, including some I have contributed to, that take the measurement question much more seriously. And actually, this has induced a revision in the way we think about consumption inequality. And this revision is, this was the initial view. This is the Kruger and Perry view. And this is actually the more current view. So if you look at papers by Aguilar and Fields, or paper by myself with other colleagues, this is what's been happening. Consumption inequality is now considered to be growing as much as income inequality in the US. And it's surprising actually that if I look at some data for China, so I take this data from Ramstetter and co-authors in 2006, using only urban consumers, so excluding rural households, there is actually a similar picture. So income inequality has been in China has been growing a lot, but consumption inequality, these are all per capita measures, seems to be tracking income inequality quite closely. There is actually, as we might expect, a level difference, but what is interesting is that in China, there is similar evidence in terms of tracking about consumption income inequality. Now, the conceptual problem is probably more serious than the measurement problem, because we would like to have a measure of consumption, we have spending. So when does consumption actually differs from spending? And obviously the question we're interested in, does this matter for measuring inequality? Now the first obvious issue is that spending includes purchases of durables, but we would like to have, in principle, consumption of non-durables and the services that we get from the non-durables. These are very hard to get in data because typically we don't observe the stocks of the durables, and without the stocks we cannot get a measure of the services we get from the durables. And there is evidence of, at least for the US, of a catch-up. So poor people are now able to buy, able to own durables, perhaps because of international trade lowering the prices of many of those. And so some of the inequality that we would see in spending does not exist, or at least is much attenuated when we look at consumption. The second is that a lot of the consumption that people Do is actually received in kind through transfers received from public sources or private sources. So in the US, this would be food stamps or housing subsidies, or it could be health care provided through things like the Medicaid or Medicare program. And these things are not necessarily easy to measure, or at least easy to record in data sets. Some consumption is home-produced, so you don't need to outsource the care of your children. For example, you can take care of your children at home. You can have a grandmother do this for you. But the most important thing, and this is where we go back to the China thing, is prices for goods that the poor and the rich actually purchase may be very different. And this again can drive a wedge between consumption and spending. So there are three issues that are important in the debate on how prices or differences in relative prices for rich consumers and poor consumers have evolved based on the debate on consumption inequality. The first is that rich and poor can consume goods that are of different quality. So this may give an impression that there is a lot of spending inequality, but in fact there may be no difference in consumption. It's just reflecting a difference in the quality of the goods that are purchased. In the same way, if there is some shopping effects, that if the rich enjoy some utility, get some utility from shopping experience, so shopping in a boutique store instead of mass merchandise store, then these things will look like there is spending inequality when in fact there is no consumption inequality. And the last item on this list is that the increase in international trade, what some people in the US call the China syndrome, reduces quite substantially prices of some goods. And in principle, we don't know whether this effect is advantageous for families at the bottom of the distribution, or it's kind of more randomly distributed. But in general, if these goods are more, the goods that are subject to the China, what is called the China syndrome, are more likely to be consumed by the poor, then the poor can afford goods that they could not afford in the past, or they could afford just more of those that they were buying in the past. So I'm going to provide some evidence. I'm going to talk about some of this. Now, how do we get evidence of these three elements? So in the United States, there is a data set called the AC Nielsen Home Scan, which provides information on every purchase of a good with a so-called universal product code. In these data sets, households that typically spend at some stores, typically general retail or mass merchandise stores, receive a home scan, something similar to the thing you see in the supermarket, and every time they buy a good, they scan the barcode, and the information of the barcode is recorded. And as you probably know, the barcode, there is a lot of information. There's information about the good, the weight, the price, where you bought it, and so forth. So you can do actually quite a lot with this data set. So this data set covers mostly products sold in grocery stores, or drugstores, and mass merchandise stores. These account for about 40% of the expenditure on goods that you would find in the consumer price index. And in a typical quarter, this is a big data set. So there are 55,000 households in this data set. There are about 700,000 goods included in each quarter for which we have data. So how do we measure quality? So the first thing, this is actually all when I talk about this based on work that Broad and Weinstein have done for the US. So the first thing we want to get is like the price of the good after taking out the quality effect. So how do we get this price? So suppose I buy 2 pounds of salmon for $20 and you buy 1 pound of salmon for $15. So the unit cost, so the cost per unit of good, in this case a pound of salmon, would be $10 for me and $15 for you. Because we purchase the same type of good, 1 pound of salmon, the difference in the unit cost must reflect the quality. So probably I bought this at Walmart, which for those of you who have visited the United States is this place where you find very low prices, and you purchase at Whole Foods, which again, for those who have visited the United States, know that it's one place where things cost very much lower. So the inference is that you bought a high quality fish, so regressing the log unit value is price per pound against the total expenditure, so measured income, you effectively have a sort of angle curves for the quality of the good. And what we see is that, of course, as we might expect, the quality of the goods that people purchase increase with the level of income or the level of total spending. So the rich people, those who are disposable distribution, have higher quality associated with the purchases than the people at the bottom of the distribution, people who spend the total budget down here. And of course, a lot of this positive load can also reflect the shopping experience. That is the fact that there is a uniform, a homogeneous good like a Kit Kat, but it reflects very different prices if you buy it at the 7-Eleven, the very small convenience store, or if you have looked at your mini bar at the Ridge Trail, you could see the prices are very different than what you would find in the supermarket. Now, how do they decompose? The first thing they notice is that there is a difference in the expenses versus intensive margin of the differences in spending between rich and poor. So they divide households in their data set in 3 income tercile, and they measure the excess consumption in the high income versus the excluded group, which is the low income people, and the middle income versus, again, the excluded group, which is the low income. So the high income people consume 74% more than the low income. No big surprise. But what they say is, okay, where is this difference coming from? And they notice that there are 2 types of difference. There is an intensive margin. The rich may just buy more milk, let's say, if the only good we are interested is milk. And the second is the extensive margin. The rich may actually consume a greater variety of that homogeneous product, which is milk. They can buy the organic milk together with the normal milk, they can buy the soy milk, they can buy the no-lactose milk or the low-lactose milk, etc., etc., etc. So this can be captured because the difference in expenditure, total expenditure between poor and rich, can be decomposed into this intensive margin, which is how much more of the common goods the rich consume relative to the poor, and how much more variety the rich consume of a certain good relative to the poor. And what they find is that most of the difference is actually the intensive margin. The rich buy more of the common UPCs, so the common goods, but there's also a little effect. 20% of the difference is coming from the fact that they have a more varied portfolio of goods. So they have more variety in general. Now, here instead is the difference between the quality and the shopping effect that we were talking about. So the rich and poor actually have different prices for the goods that they purchase. One interesting thing that comes out of this AC Nielsen home scan is that the poor pay less for the goods that they purchase. So this 32.9 means that the typical price for milk paid by the rich is 33% more than the price for milk that is purchased by a poor household. And between middle and low income, there is a lower difference, but still is a positive one. So the rich pay more for the goods. Where is it coming from? It's coming mostly from the fact that when they buy baby milk, let's say, they buy more pricey organic baby milk. This is the quality effect. But they also buy it at stores, like Whole Foods instead of Walmart, where there is a shopping effect or shopping experience effect. This is really a residual. We don't know if it's that or something else. It's what remains after taking out the quality effect, which is really the only thing we can measure. Now, this makes a difference in terms of measurement because the fact that prices for these goods are different between poor and rich means that you cannot use the same consumer price index for rich houses and poor houses. You want to construct a price index that reflects the fact that the poor, for whatever reasons, perhaps they spend more time looking for better deals, perhaps they go to the Walmart store or to the Costco store and spend a little bit of their time chasing the better deals or using the coupons, etc., to reduce the prices for the goods that they purchase. Whatever that is, we cannot use a common price index. We need to adjust the price index for the fact that people have different prices for their spending. And this actually, if we do that, results in lower inequality, of course, because with the same dollar you can get more consumption if you're poor than if you're rich. And obviously, partly is indulgence, choices. But if we do that, inequality goes from the 90-10 income ratio using a common price index goes from 4.4 to 4.2. So there's a 20 percentage point difference once we control for the difference in prices. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the China syndrome. So what are the effects of increasing openness to China imports for US consumers? There are, of course, two main effects. The first is on wages and employment. In those sectors that are exposed to competition from China, wages and employment, standard theory will tell us that they will decline. And typically these effects will be primarily on low-skilled workers in manufacturing industry in the US. And there's a lot of evidence on this, for example, work by Otto and Dorn and Hanson, more recently in the AR. The second effect is the prices of goods exposed to competition also decline. Now, in principle, there is no reason to expect this to be particularly concentrated or particularly advantageous for certain types of households, unless the type of goods that we import from China, the US imports from China, are primarily consumed by poor households rather than the rich houses. So the argument that I'm going to put forward with just simple reasoning is that poor houses seem to lose from the first effect. Poor houses are the low-skilled workers in manufacturing, but they seem to gain from the second because they are mostly the consumers of the goods that we import from China. So how to measure China's incident in US prices? So the second element of the equation. So suppose that we allocate goods that we observe in this AC Nielsen home scan to about 128 what is called modules. So a module can be vitamins, could be kitchen gadgets, could be wine, could be pasta, and so forth. For each module J and each time T, we can define a Chinese import share as the total Chinese imports in the US in this particular module time T, divided all the imports in the US that come from all types of countries on that particular module T. Now this number, for those of you who have followed some international trade statistics, has been growing a lot. So the total trade in the US between 1990 and 2015 has increased by more than 1,000%, as opposed to other countries with like 300%. So there is increasing international trade, but a lot is coming from China, of course. And this regression shows that, stop me when I'm going over time, okay? I'm good? I have just a few slides. So these regressions shows that there is a negative impact on the typical price coming from those particular goods that are more exposed to competition from China. So prices on average decline. But if you look at the difference between the basket of goods consumed by the poor and the basket of goods consumed by the rich, most of the price decline that is due to increasing openness to China is experienced or is advantageous for the poor rather than for the rich. The difference in the coefficients, for example, are minus 0.12 for the median model and minus 0.12 for the general price index for all goods that are consumed by the rich and poor. So the poor households are actually the main beneficiaries of increasing openness in terms of enjoying lower prices for the goods that are consumed. So this is a force for good. This is something that effectively reduces consumption inequality because it allows poor houses to buy more or to actually divert some of the income that we're spending on more expensive goods on other goods. And this graph tells you the story. So these are the two budget constraints of poor and rich. These are utility function. I'm assuming perfect substitutability. Now, if I have a shift in the budget constraint induced by the fact that the global good, the good coming from China is now cheaper, less expensive, you may have cases in which the preferences of the rich remain the same. So they keep consuming the local good or the very expensive good produced in the Silicon Valley, while for the poor households who purchase the global good that is more exposed to international competition, they can actually have an increase in the consumption they can afford. They can now move on a higher utility curve. So there is increasing welfare that we record for the poor houses, but not for the rich houses. So this is a force for good. What about the effect on employment wages? This is more contentious because recent evidence show that while the poor houses in general as an aggregate may benefit from lower prices, they actually are the ones mostly hurt by openness to China because they earn lower wages in those industries that are more exposed to competition from China. They also decline in employment. So clearly both will tend to decline, will tend to reduce consumption at the bottom of the distribution, in this case enhancing or increasing consumption inequality. And the only factor that may sort of attenuate these negative effects are either the perception these effects are temporary, but we don't really believe that. Most of the jobs that are gone because of international trade are actually probably gone for good. And the second is that part of the attenuation may come from increased insurance coming from the government. And this is actually something that recent researchers found. So in the United States, there is a program called Trade Adjustment Assistance that is supposed to help individuals that are hurt by, who work and are hurt by international trade in terms of retraining them and giving them better opportunities in different sectors. But this program doesn't really work very well. Mostly, a lot of people actually move on to programs where they get provided with kind of long-term insurance, like disability insurance. Not necessarily because of health conditions, but because it's the only program in the US that actually offers some long-term insurance. But of course, it doesn't target the right people. So, how much time do you have? Am I done? 5 minutes. Now, I wanted to just point out to the fact that even if we were able to solve this this problem of measurement and prices, etc., the consumption level is actually a very interesting topic because it's very easy to lose track of what we're trying to measure. So suppose I take a perspective on food. This is actually some data from the US. This is what you would get in terms of consumption inequality if you were just looking at spending on food in a data set like PSAP. So increasing consumption, so spending inequality. These other two lines are a modest attempt to correct either for the fact that a lot of the consumption that some households enjoy come from food stamps program, so transfers from the public sector. So the blue line now includes not only the spending in supermarkets, but also the monetary value of food stamps. Now this shows a very dramatic, especially in this period, a very dramatic decline in inequality now in consumption. And the green line here at the bottom is another somewhat modest attempt, because I don't have the Nielsen Homescan data here, just to use different price index for food at home and food away from home. And this shows again a decline. So this kind of is important in itself. More important is the fact is, what are we really interested in when we think about food? Are we interested in the monetary value or the consumption, or even something else like the caloric intake? And the caloric intake, there's a lot of evidence showing that it hasn't really changed. If anything, the fact that now you can buy a McDonald's for $1 in most stores means that the caloric intake, if anything, has increased among the poor households because of poor consumption than among rich houses. Again, we don't want to be paternalistic. These may be choices rather than needs. Agri and Hurst have a series of papers showing that while there is declining spending at key points in the life cycle, like when people retire, if we look at the caloric intake, we don't see much of a decline. And we can make the same argument for there might be an increase in income inequality, but if we look at the caloric intake inequality between poor and rich households, we don't actually see it. And then if we are on this train of thoughts, perhaps we're not even interested in the caloric intake. We are interested in the health that food actually gives us. Perhaps we want to measure the food that we consume, not in terms of the calories that we get, but how good these calories are. And this is exactly what some people have done. So they construct a healthy eating index. So they assign a score to the type of nutritional content of the food that you ingest. So they give a 10 if you consume a kale salad, or give a 0 if you consume a McDonald's. And this shows that while there has been an increase in health, the health index for the high socioeconomic status, perhaps because of the campaign about eating well, there hasn't been much of a progress here at the bottom of the distribution. So the issue is more general than just looking at spending. And okay, so I'm going to conclude by saying things are really hard, especially when it comes to measuring consumption inequality for a number of measurement and conceptual issues. So if the utility between consumption measures is a better way than income to measure the well-being of households, we need a complete welfare analysis that takes into account differences in prices, the fact that people may value leisure differently, and the fact that we want to measure also the quality of the good that people consume rather than just counting the dollars that they spend.
Question and comments. Any question and comments on that?
Orazio from the Cairns Institute. Thank you for the stimulating presentation. Okay. I like the fact that you ended on the purpose of consumption. If the purpose of consumption is to improve health and well-being, and also your conclusion that this is a very complex issue, issues about nature. I just wanted to make it a bit more complex and to see your perspectives on this. And here I have in mind in the public health area, the work of people like Michael Mamet from the UK on the social determinants of health. The idea that, and a lot of studies showing that even adjusting for economic inequality, whether consumption or income, and a whole range of other inequalities, a critical factor being the social inequality, where you sit in the social hierarchy. Particularly, there's something called the control factor. Irrespective of which society you live in or which organization, workplace you live in, the fact that where you sit, whether you have the latitude, job latitude, whether you have the control to be able to make decisions, whether somebody is always looking across your shoulder in terms of what you do or not. So the social dimension is a critical. In fact, some of the studies after controlling for income and all of that, we came up with the conclusion that up to a third of the health inequalities we experience actually arise from the social dimensions of inequality. Yeah. Just your perspective.
So thanks for this question. So I'm actually very sympathetic with this topic because I'm doing some work on the network effects on consumption. So we actually had the opportunity to study the consumption behavior of the entire Danish population. And for the Danish population, we observe different types of networks people may belong to, so family, but in particular co-workers. So this goes back to the hierarchy. So we were looking at how the consumption of your peers would actually influence your consumption. Now we couldn't go as deep as you probably want us to because we had either an aggregate measure of consumption or we could look at consumption of certain items that we thought were more conspicuous. So it could be the luxury items, the jewelry, it could be the car, it could be the clothing. We didn't find much evidence that actually in the conspicuous consumption, at least for Danes, was very important. But in general, we find evidence that peers influence each other. There is also an important element, I think this is the one you also referred to, which is about information. So especially in the health domain, a lot of information about what is good, what is bad may come from actually the people surrounding you. So this is the social aspect. There are also negative influences coming from peers. For example, some stories circulated around the financial crisis that claim that a lot of the debt exposure at the bottom of the distribution was coming from some attempts of poor houses to imitate the consumption of the rich houses. The rich houses were getting richer, so I was trying to imitate or keeping up with them. So my wages were stagnating. The only way to actually keep up with them was to get in debt. And this was actually something negative that is still waiting on the balance sheet of the houses. So this is very good set of issues.
Okay, we are running out of time a little bit, so let's take 2 questions. For other people, if you have questions, you can talk with Luigi later. We are going to have a tea break. First, Hamid.
Thank you, Luigi, for a very stimulating and great talk about this important literature. So my question is, when you talk about measures of the deficiencies of measuring income inequality, which is a cross-sectional measure, I think you are right to point out the consumption or well-being inequality is more important. But here, when you talk about consumption inequality, other than the measurement issue, I was wondering whether you have also thought about the measurement of consumption inequality is mostly at the cross-sectional level. It seems to have this inequality measure has ignored the possibility of mobility at the consumption level. Right? So when people working in the income inequality literature, they look at cross-sectional income inequality, but also try to get an idea of how malleable this is, how likely you can move from one quartile of the income distribution to the next quartile and so on. So I was wondering whether there has been any attempt in looking at consumption inequality in terms of mobility as well.
By me, in the Journal of European Economic Association. So again, totally sympathetic. The issue of measuring dynamic aspects with consumption is that we don't have good data. So the CX, as you know, is at most 1 year. So the measures of mobility you can compute is only from one quarter to another. The PSA is still in its infancy in terms of good measure of consumption. So there is not a long-term perspective of mobility. We did something with an Italian data set that actually has panel information, income and consumption mobility. And we actually compare back-to-back mobility in income with mobility in consumption, finding actually something that we were not expecting. That is, if you believe the permanent income hypothesis, you should find more concentration in consumption than you find in income. And the sad story is that you actually were finding less concentration in consumption and income, and the reason was that there was more measurement problem, more measurement error in consumption and in income. And once you have measurement error, whatever you look at a transition matrix, you have numbers all over the place. And so, in the absence of validation studies for consumption, as opposed to income, it's really hard to pin down the extent of measurement in consumption and income. So this is again, as you know, it's much harder to measure consumption than to income, because income can be a single item on your pay bill, pay stub, how much you get paid by your employer. It's a single number. To recall consumption, everything you have consumed in the last 3 months or 6 months, is much harder. So this is the reason why I'm very much of a fan of these research attempts by different people, including people in the CX, to try to reduce the amount of recollection by either asking people to have a home scan or to open a Mint.com account where I can record what you do, or to have access to their credit card statements, or any electronic form that gets us as close as possible as an administrative measure of consumption would actually reduce this problem and get us at a point where we would like to do exactly what you're suggesting, which is getting a dynamic view about mobility rather than the cross-section study. But
Thank you very much. Just two quick comments or questions. The first one on the data issue. In some countries, consumers hardly use any cash. Basically, all their consumption behavior is recorded by, say, credit card or debit card. So probably it's an even better source of information for income. Second comment, you briefly touched upon the measurement of inequality in terms of income, in terms of consumption. Now, it comes to mind the question of how much consumers spend their income on consumption. It varies between developed economy and developed economy, basically developing and developed. Also between high saving society and low saving society. So in some economies like the US, they borrow to consume, right? I wonder how you deal with this kind of issues. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So going back to the point that we discussed with handling, so we do have some administrative source on consumption that could potentially be used. So some of my students were using information on a financial software, financial website called min.com, where you can actually put all your accounts and aggregate it. So I have an account on min.com, so I have my checking account, my credit card account, my retirement accounts. I'm also connected with Zillow.com, so it gives me the value of my house, the value of my car. So I know a Toyota from 2000 is not in good shape, it will give me. So this gives me a complete picture of my consumption, my income, my spending, and my wealth. So this is a case in which it's true. If people basically don't use cash, then you get a complete picture of what people spend in a given month, actually sometimes at a daily level. You don't have a lot of detailed information what people spend on, because I would get a bill for $200 on my credit card statements from Walmart. I may be spending $200 in a toy or $200 in etc. So I am super sympathetic to moving away from asking people what they spend their money on, because a lot of people will not recall, especially the petty kind of spending, like for $2 cash coffee in a supermarket. I don't remember. I will never remember these things so accurately. And your second question was, sorry.
Measurement of inequality in terms of income or consumption.
Oh, there was an issue about developing versus non. Angus Deaton, who won the Nobel this year, was a strong advocate of using consumption as a measure of well-being in developing economies, because developing countries have more serious measurement in measuring income rather than consumption. For rich advanced countries, it's not that clear. Because of access to technology, the borrowing, the savings, the credit markets may be working better, etc. So I think the jury's out there. If we don't solve the measurement problem that I tried to highlight today, there is still some case to be made for using income as or wealth. If you are a Piketty fund, wealth gives you another kind of long-term perspective, because wealth, of course, is the integral of all the savings you made in the past. So in some cases can be a better measure than well-being, especially if you account for the fact that there is a life cycle perspective on wealth. So you may be you have very low wealth at the beginning of the life cycle, but you're not necessarily poor in terms of permanent income, because you're just borrowing at that stage in order to finance your consumption. So it's a good set of issues. I'm not necessarily an advocate of consumption inequality. I've done some paper on consumption inequality, so I'm pushing for it, but I think there are circumstances in which consumption is not as good as we might think. And thank you for your questions.
We are roughly 8 minutes late. So just two housekeeping things. First one is the cafe outside actually does not belong to us. So basically, we are not supposed to sit at the table there unless we purchase from them. Okay. Secondly, we can have photos. Our photographer, Dr. Daniel, is going to organize this for us, and we're going to take a photo on the steps just outside in this room. Okay.